time for me. And so that brings us to the beginning of the panel. I think let's go in alphabetical order with brief introductions. So that's going to be me, and then that's going to be Justine, and then Kate and Vita by our first name. So I'm Emily Bergslin. I'm moderating Making Magic Systems. I am coming to you from actually St. Paul, Minnesota. I lied earlier. It's the other twin. And I am co-author of a novella called Uncommon Charm with my wife, Catherine Weaver. So, Justine.
Hi, I'm Justine Manzano. I am the YA author of The Order of the Key and the soon-to-be released Skeleton Key sequel, which features a pretty cool magic system. If I had fun creating it, and also the YA contemporary novel Never Say Never. I'm also an editor and I work at Right Hive actually, another pretty cool conference. So yeah, that's me.
And I'm Kate Hartfield. I'm a writer in Ottawa, Canada. I have had a couple of novellas and a couple of text-based games, and 2 novels come out. My most recent novel is called The Embroidered Book, and it's a historical fantasy novel that has an 18th century sacrifice-based magic system that's pretty central to the plot. So I thought a lot about the world building and the ethics of that magic system. So I love talking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Hi, I'm Vita Cruz, talking to you from Manila. I have a short story collection coming out locally called Song of the Mango and Other New Myths. And I work mostly in short story, which means that I get to create a new magic system with every story I write. This is the book I have out right now. It's called Beyond the Line of Trees. You can buy it on Gumroad.
Wow, you
Oh, and
really
I
have
also
to do it.
Oh, sorry, what?
I was going to say you do it every time, again and again and again. And I
Yeah.
was actually going to start out with you because in our brief emails to each other, I mean, you touched on in like 1 or 2 sentences, basically everything that I thought we want to talk about, from like hard magic systems to more magical realists and metaphorical ones. So I think what I'd really like to ask all of you, and we can work this out between ourselves, what order you want to take this in. So how did you know, and how do you know, when you're doing it again and again, that you need a system, and in what way is a magic system exciting or necessary to you?
Personally, I like to take a look at, I like to have an idea of what's going on behind the scenes for anything I work on. I think it's really important to know how things work. And so even if I don't feel like it needs to be a magic system that's thoroughly expressed throughout the story, I do like to have a little background work on how things work, what the rules are, if there are any limits, what the limits are, and really kind of hammer that out in advance. I'm definitely a planner in writing, so if you're a pantser, maybe that's not a way the way you go about things, but that's definitely how I do it. I definitely make sure that I have things as spelled out as I can throughout, at least now as a more experienced writer. When I first started, I just kind of would wing it and then figure it out halfway through that there needed to be some kind of restraints. But now that I've got a couple of books out there, I definitely do a lot of planning before I dive in.
Yeah, I think one way it often starts for me, especially with longer projects, is the need for some sort of constraints. As Justine mentioned, the limits. Sometimes that's where it starts because it's just a pragmatic thing when it comes to the plot. Is you have to decide. If everybody could do anything they wanted, then that makes it more difficult to plot in some ways. So sometimes understanding what people can't do is one way into a magic system, and deciding what the cost of magic is going to be, or what the effect of doing magic, what the consequences are on the characters, is often quite important for me as well.
didn't get to articulate this until we had our email exchange, but I realized that unconsciously what I do is whatever element of fiction is I think, the strongest in the piece I'm working on, I sort of invent a magic system around that. For example, if the setting is very strong, let's say I have a setting that is a library, a magical library, the magic system becomes words based and paper based. And then if it's like a character piece, like something I wrote that hasn't been published yet, the magic system is, I'm not sure how to, okay, I'm going to describe it. We've got witches and their magical powers are determined by the skills of their fathers. So it comes out as a metaphor with the witch.
So I think that this is getting into something that I wanted to talk about, how much of making a magic system is craft-based versus like the necessity of the fiction, having to have like a scaffolding behind the rule. How do you work it into narrative? Take it as broadly as you can, if you'd like. Great.
I'll grab that one. Yeah, I sort of bouncing off what Vita was talking about. Often I look to the story, to the themes of the story, and to the motifs of the story to feed my ideas about my magic system. And so there is underneath it, there is, you know, as a games writer as well, I do think about the sort of the stats level, the mechanics of the magic system to some degree. But then there is also many layers on top of that that are narrative layers and that have to do with theme and character. And so I love making those things work together. So in my 18th century novel, I have, you know, the magic is a metaphor for power, and there are sacrifices that one has to make to enchant objects. And so this is mirrored in the sacrifices that my main characters, who are two queens, Marie Antoinette and her sister Charlotte, they have to make sacrifices to and sort of lose bits of themselves and metaphorically as they go along. And there's also a lot of sort of Enlightenment level math and some medieval less understandable, less comprehensible stuff happening underneath it that nobody really understands. So there's sort of different layers of history and world building built into it.
Sounds really cool. For me, my characters are given their abilities based on I guess, their characteristics. So I have a world where there are layers of abilities, and there are characters who have abilities that involve, you know, things with their body, super like enhanced strength, enhanced speed, and those characters are usually very like gruff and like strong and stubborn. And then there are characters that are there that have to do with the mind, where they can like do things, move things with their mind, or read minds, telepathy, telekinesis, empathic abilities, things along those lines. And those characters are always the more introspective, the more thinking characters. They're the abilities that I gave them in constructing my magic system were initially based on who my characters were. I knew the characters that I wanted for my story, and then I gave them abilities that mirrored that in some way. And I feel like there is some plot stuff. There was some things I needed the characters to be able to do. And so I needed to grant them these abilities. But I mainly just drew together a bunch of people who had different abilities that mirrored their personalities and their characteristics and how they got along and how that shifted throughout the story, and then had fun putting them together in different combinations to accomplish different things.
So a lot of a lot of the stuff I write, apart from having a magic system, also deals with creatures of mythology, especially Philippine mythology. To that end, magic and ghosts and all that stuff is pretty normal here in our everyday. And okay, well, magic maybe not too much, but it's arguable who you talk to. But what I've realized with my work is that the more powerful a character of mine is, the less human they act, and not like monster level, but more like get they. It's like a spectrum between human to god. The more powerful they are, the closer they are to acting godly. So they become a little distant from more human concerns. And I didn't even realize I do this. It it hit me when I was thinking about this panel. But so the stories that I write, they occur when what happens when some there's someone who has no magic and then they end up gaining magic, or they end up having to encounter magic, or somebody they love is magical or is suddenly magical. How does that change their entire world?
Mhm, mhm. It's I think good that you mentioned drawing from myth and from reality too, because I was joking in the email thread that I find it very funny that I am moderating this because our magic system is that there isn't one. We ended up talking to a lot of chaos magicians and to real life occultists. So, how much do you feel that you are drawing from life um, and from tradition in general? And how do you use that, all of you?
We're like having a battle of eyes, like who goes first. I
Well,
think
not me.
I think that when it comes to drawing from tradition, I didn't really want to do anything that I kind of just came up with things on my own. I think everything you do in your writing is somehow mirrored in like is mirroring a bunch of our past reads and our past experiences. So I don't want to say I came up with it completely originally because I totally didn't. But I did want to try to create a combination of things that I felt were different enough from what I'd read that I could bring new interest. But like it's there's a wide net that I'm casting there. I mean, in dealing with elements and in dealing with the mind and the body and drawing on different kinds of philosophies about that as far as like how our mind can affect our body, particularly because I have characters who are there's a main romance in the story, and one is the body key, which is the one that's in control of the body magic, and then there's the mind key, and those two things, when they're working together, they're stronger, and they are able to push each other along and move towards new things, new abilities, new heights. And so I feel like a lot of that drew from the fact that I have a very close friend who's a yogi and who speaks about the connection between mind and body often. And so it became a very important thing for me to try to reproduce in that portion of the story. Now, I do touch on other elements, and there are other portions that really are more, I guess, traditional magic based. But for that, I wanted to kind of explore the spirituality of yoga or of meditation and play with that in a magic form.
Mhm.
I think that I'm always drawing on tradition, and there are several answers to why. The first is that I have ADHD, so I really need a foundation before I can mess with it, you know?
Feel that
the second,
time.
right. The second is so like, if you're not familiar, the Philippines was colonized thrice, and there are a lot of us, especially people like me who live in Manila. We are disconnected from who we were, what our culture was. We There are very few records of the things we used to do. So we look to our closest neighbors from other provinces and other tribes to figure out what it was that we used to do. And some of those practices are closed, so that limits what I can draw from. And the rest of it, to not appropriate, I just try to imagine a different way of doing magic. But that said, I am also something of a magic practitioner. Does that mean that I am writing about my practice when I'm writing stories? Maybe subconsciously, but not overtly. But for example, I still have yet to write a story that is all about tarot cards, which is my main thing. Someday I will do it, but I think not now because I don't think I am in the headspace to process exactly what is going on here. Cat. Sorry.
I see it too. I'm doing it too. I'm like, where is it going?
Sorry, my familiar is very active this morning, so she's hogging the screen time for sure. um, yeah, I for me, because I tend to write in historical settings, so I do think a lot about drawing from life in that sense. So I tend to ground my magic a lot in research and try to make the magic feel as though it fits the setting. So for me, it's less about drawing from my own life and practice and spirituality, although I suppose that probably comes into it in a less deliberate way than I realize. But yeah, I do think a lot about what would be sort of maybe not natural, but what would be a fitting form of magic for the people in the setting that I'm writing about. So that often, that's where I get my best ideas too, is because life is stranger than anything we can create. So, if you find something in the research that is just weird and wonderful, that goes in.
Mm-hmm. And I did want to, of course, correct myself a little bit when I was talking earlier. Often what we see as being a deviation from reality, so like other traditions and so on, is just anything that is not like Western Christian Enlightenment consensus reality. So I just wanted to put that out there. I think we're all on the same page in that respect, but it is something that matters to me a lot. So how much do you actually plan all of this? Because that's alien to me. I've never done it. And Kat writes a brief outline, but that's about it.
I'm the worst with this. I plan way too much. I plan like as much as I can. I really do sit down and have like a little mini book about what is going to happen in my book and how it works. And mostly, and it's funny because I feel like Vita said earlier that she needs to root herself on things that exist because she has ADHD and it helps ground. But I am like, I need to plan everything out in advance because I have ADHD. And I'll go in like a million different directions if I don't like have a plan in advance. Because what happens in my plans is as I'm working on my outline, I have about 40 different thoughts going on at once, and then I pare those down as I tighten the outline and get more centered and focused. But always my outlines begin with things that are all over the place and little snippets of scenes, things that I think I want to do. And then I have to work on the plot and how it's going to work and how the magic systems are going to work and things like that, and figure out what things are possible and what things won't make sense in any way that I try to form the system that I'm creating. So for me, the plan really helps because my plans are very chaotic. And then as I get closer to actual writing time, those plans become tighter and tighter until I actually have like a system and a way that things are going to work. But yeah, my planning system is it's sometimes like I have books that I'm sort of starting to plan that I probably won't write for a couple of years.
Mhm, mhm. Evita, you have to do this a lot since you're writing short stories.
That's true.
I can't wrap my
I
head around that, but how many times you have to like create from, that's awesome.
I mean, I think
But-
I'm doing shorter work, but
Well, I do have a cheat for that, and that is my comfort zone is fairy tales. So a lot of my magic systems work on fairy tale logic.
mhm.
And if it makes sense somehow, and even if I'm not able to articulate it, I am going to trust that it will make sense for whoever is going to read it because the story still works. That said, it really does depend on the story whether or not I'm going to plan something. It definitely, if it's a longer story, I am going to open an Excel file. I'm going to make a lot of tabs, and one of those tabs is the magic system, and I'm gonna go make charts and color code them, and like which this thing is called this thing needs this to work, that sort of thing. But other than that, I guess that is my cheat. I work in fairy tale and metaphor.
Mhm. Which has a very straightforward kind of logic, even if you may not understand it at first glance. Okay.
Yeah, I find the length of story really makes a difference to how much I plan. Because I have quite a lot of short stories that have some sort of magical element to them, and often I have not filled in the entire, the entire stuff that magic. If there's a witch in the story, there's a witch in the story, and the witch does something, and that's great. And I also work a lot in sort of fairy tale modes in short fiction. With novels, I find I usually have to plan more. I have evolved into a planner over the years. I started out as not a planner, and now I have learned to embrace the Excel spreadsheet and various Scrivener research files and that kind of thing. And I think just because the length of the story, because the plot tends to have so many moving parts in it, I find that I need to have more planning when it comes to the logic of the magic system, just so that I know what what the consequences will be, what the choices are that are available to the character. Go by feel a little bit more, but that's a big generalization, and that's not always how it works for sure.
Mhm. We've got a great question from the chat, which is, what was the first time where you read a book that you thought about this magic system? Oh, this rules. This is so cool.
Sabriel by Garth Nix.
Yes, that is a big
Yeah.
one for me too. Mhm.
So I'm very rooted in comics and superheroes, which that's my favorite thing. I'm a huge geek for comic books. And so my favorite system, and I don't know if it's so much a magic system as a power system, is from Brandon Sanderson's Epic series. And it is about superheroes who when they use their powers, as they use their abilities, it slowly drains the humanity from them, and not in the way that Vito was talking about earlier, where it makes them more godlike and detached and sort of like looking over people. This is more, it actually just slowly makes them evil. They become selfish and cruel, and they don't realize it. And then the heroes of the story who do have abilities and are just starting to use their abilities now have to figure out a way to mitigate that in order to stop the bad ones. And I found it so interesting, just because of the fact that I felt like it did impose really strong limitations, and it did make the characters just not able to do everything. Like they were limited in how they were able to fight in a way that villains of the series weren't, because they were able to use their magic full blast because they didn't care what it was doing to them. And I just thought it was such an amazing way of playing with superpowers. Also, it was really cool to see like a Superman type character be completely evil and kind of scary. Um,
I'm thinking back to the first books I read that that really made me fall in love with magic, and they were not really systematized. Actually, I think The Hounds of the Morrigan by Pat O'Shea, I'll put that in chat, is one of my favorite books of all time. And that, I think, really made me fall in love with a sort of chaotic fairy tale, mythological, traditional forms of magic, and from Ireland. And the other one that I'll mention is the Damar books by Robin McKinley, Hero in the Crown and the Blue Sword, which have, again, a kind of magic system that is systematized, but also there's a layer underneath it that nobody really understands. And that part of it appealed to me, that sort of duality of people trying to understand things that at their root are not wanting to be understood in some way.
If I may return to Sabriel a bit, if for
Yeah.
people who don't know the book, Sabriel is a reverse necromancer. She keeps the dead down, and she does this by the power of 7 bells that are strapped to her via, I forgot what it was, a belt, and they have many different uses. And if you use them in death, which has, I think, 7 levels, depending on where you are, they also have very different, much stronger effects. And it's just a great book. It was a great system. It still wows me every time I think about it.
Mhm. I mean, I'm still the mod here, but I'm going to mention briefly again, a lot of what we do takes from chaos magic. A little anachronistic. We're writing stories from the 20s, and chaos magic is very 1980s. But we pulled a lot from just straight up magician text. So I'm not sure if I have an actual question about this, but I'm noticing, of course, that the theme of sacrifice here and functional magic. I wonder if we can just talk about that in general. Like, do we have feelings on why people so often, and we so often, return to the idea of sacrifice being necessary, or losing part of oneself being necessary in magic?
I think it's because it feels like life, that when you go through life and you do lose, and that power can do that to you, that we see a lot of corruption um up in the higher levels of power. And I think that with magic, I feel like it's often a way of, I see somebody wrote something in the chat about capitalist society, and yes, that's where I'm going with this. I feel like power can be so corrupting. It's actually a theme of my book, that it does make you into something often that you would never have foreseen had you stayed as your lowly, powerless self. And I feel like that we see it so much in life that it feels real to us. And this idea of heroes of stories dealing with the quandary of what to sacrifice and how much is too much of themselves to sacrifice becomes a huge theme because of that, because we want to survive. And if we're thinking along the lines of capitalist society, we want to have some power over our lives and not just be slaves to that. But as we try to reach for more, we are playing more into the system that pushes us down. And so I feel like it is a very real metaphor and a very real feeling for people. And that's why when you're creating a world, I think that's why it has so much resonance with readers and with authors.
Yeah, I definitely have played with that as well, and I think it's really interesting in terms of the character development and in terms of how humans interact with their world. I think that that's one reason why it's really compelling for writers to deal with sacrifices. Another thing for me on a sort of world building level was thinking of just the sort of scientific principle that nothing is created or destroyed. So, for something new to exist in the world, it's a transformation rather than a creation. So there's something that is being transformed into something else. And so that's the root of the magic system in my most recent novel, is that, you can create an enchantment, you can add power to an object, but that comes because it's almost an equation. You can think of it as a cost, or you can think of it as an equation that something else therefore has changed somewhere else.
I think I'm gonna come at it from a slightly different perspective
Please
because,
do.
all right, I mean, I don't mean to generalize, but the West is more technological and the East is more spiritual. So when I think about magic, and I'm not that religious a person, but when I think about magic, I think it is the thing we turn to when we have already sacrificed everything. So the magic that I think about is not really something that deals in sacrifices because we've already given up a lot. Um, in that sense, I guess you could think of magic, especially Philippine magic, actually, as a metaphor for the connection with the divine, your connection with God, whether that is the Catholic Christian God or the pre-colonial gods that we used to have. And definitely in some tribes a sacrifice of like a boar is necessary, or a chicken or whatever, but it's not, I mean, I know this is real world magic, but it's not that a sacrifice from you, like you put your own blood into something or give a hair, it's not that common. So I think it's just differences in what our values are, what our core beliefs are. And so, without even knowing it, that is the kind of magic I deal in when I write.
Thank you for bringing that up too, because I actually was just thinking about cultivation fantasies and that and Chinese fantasy with that genre, and also in Uncommon Charm, the relationships between a particular character and God is very, very important. And so just that, I think, breaking away from the idea of it being a take and give situation is something good to look at. We have something in the chat here because I'm pausing while I think of another question.
I will say though that I think it's really, really cool that we all kind of approach this from a different direction, and I think it just makes for a really great conversation.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun hearing where everybody else is and how they're thinking.
Yeah, and one thing I find really interesting about the various approaches to magic is thinking about how characters within the story might see them from different angles as well, right? So that if you might have a character who is thinking about an offering in a particular way, or a character who refuses to think about anything that they can't systematize or make mathematical, but they could be using the same magic and understanding it differently. So that's really fun as well.
How do we? Oh, please go ahead. I didn't want to.
I was just gonna say, for me, and this is gonna sound crazy if like making a magic system is really difficult for you, but I find it interesting when there are two or more magic systems competing in a story, or when they're complementary in some way, but the characters don't see it yet. My example, I guess, is Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. There's alchemy, there's alkahestry. They're the same thing, but they are expressed and manifested differently.
And I just completely lost my question. Does the audience have anything to ask? We've got about 15 minutes left here. Let's see.
I did just see one pop up. Yeah.
Yeah. and that was what I was about to ask. So just for anybody who's not in the chat in the future, what are the essential elements of a magic system you personally need to have planned out before you start writing?
Limits.
Mm-hmm.
100%. I need to know what can't be done because I don't want to later invent, while I'm working on the story, invent something that feels out of place for my characters or that feels like too much. And you don't want a Deus Ex Machina in your story where they magic their way out at the very end and you had no idea they could do a thing and they somehow managed to do it. You want to know what can be done and what absolutely cannot, and the rules of that. And if there is a way to accomplish something that cannot be done, you want to know how. Because I feel like you have to, in order for you to up the stakes, there has to be a way that you can push past the conventional limits of what you've created, or else, they'll always do the same 5 things. But if you're creating that, you want to make sure that your reasoning behind how they push past those limits is sound and is in the story and makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely think about those things as well. And another thing that I think about a lot is who can do magic in the story. And I'll just give a little shout out here to the podcast World Building for Masochists, which I was a guest on recently, and we had a conversation about the ethics of magic systems. And so this is something I think is really interesting, is deciding who can do magic, and stories where magic is inborn, for example, that comes with a whole set of ethical questions. There are sort of colonialist and imperialist ideas that can be behind who can do magic and why. And then if you have a skill-based magic system that anyone can learn, how does that fit into hierarchies within the world as well? So I think a lot about those things as well when I'm first starting out, is what are the rules for who can do magic, and are those human created rules, or are they sort of integrated into the magic itself in some way, and also kind of interrogating my own assumptions about why I've decided to go a certain way.
I got distracted by a question in the chat. Right.
To
Okay.
address it, if you like.
What I need when I'm making a magic system is I need to know the source of the magic. I need to know where it came from. So, for example, Encanto does not drive me crazy because its tone is fairy tale. So, okay, I'm going to accept that it comes with a candle. But it drives me crazy that we do not know the source of the magic in Harry Potter. Brings up a lot of questions, plot holes in the world building that JKR has never addressed. So, yeah.
Goodness, this is where I'm going to plug. There's a really excellent podcast called Shrieking Shack that ends up just delving into this big time. It is a podcast for jaded and lapsed fans. Harry Potter. Highly
What was
recommend.
that called again?
Shrieking Shack.
Okay.
So just a moment here. I'm popping back over to the chat. Because we had a question from host regarding sacrifice again. Actually, before that, so how do you differentiate magic in stories when there are the competing systems? Like, we talk about this? I'm sorry, we kind of did.
It talks about competing systems, but not really how to differentiate, I suppose. Did you want to go, Vita? I had a thought, but I don't want to hog.
No, I was just going to say, well, how do you differentiate two characters, two cultures? It is, I would say, largely the same with magic. That's about it.
In my story, I have the power-based magic, the one that I was discussing earlier, where they just have these inherent abilities. And then there's also ritual-based magic that a different group and a different culture practices. It's a dimensional, there's a dimensional split in my story, so it's a separate dimension of characters that created the ritual-based system, but anyone can work with it. And that those are two just very different ideas, so it becomes very easy to like play with one in one way and play with the other in the other without mixing any of them, if that makes sense. And so they stand out as differentiated.
Mhm.
If I may add to my answer a bit, in the Philippines, there are 85 provinces and hundreds of like ethnicities, which means there are also hundreds of ways to do magic, and they are all separated by all our little islands, all because we're an archipelago. And I'm just imagining that if one person who is, for example, they deal in the sorcery of insects, they meet somebody who deals in something at the top of my head. They deal with somebody who works with passing curses on by slapping people.
Mhm.
I don't think, and that is a thing. That is definitely a thing over here. I don't think it's all that different to differentiate magic, because they come from two different cultures, and the systems are distinct enough from each other that you can tell what is one, what is the other.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, so let's see here. So let's see here. I'm open to more questions from the audience. I do apologize. I appear to have just hit the ADHD wall.
There is a question. If it's a system that isn't based in sacrifice, do you think it's a mistake or amoral? I'm not sure how to interpret. Do we think that the sacrifice is a mistake or amoral? In that question, I think that's what the
I
question is
believe
asking.
that is what it was meant to be interpreted as, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think either way can be interesting, and interesting things to deal with in a story. There are a lot of skill-based magic systems. Like I'm thinking about Lev Grossman's system in The Magicians, which is not sacrifice-based. It's based on learning skills. I mean, characters do make choices and sacrifices in certain ways, I suppose, but it's not a strict sacrifice-based system. Or Fonda Lee's system in the Greenbone Saga, which I just finished and is excellent, is based on a resource. So Jade is a resource, and it is also skill-based, and it is also to a certain degree genetic as well. But there as well, the sacrifices are not literal. There's in the magic system. So I think you can work either way. And there are choices authors can make that are sort of ill-advised, I think, in any kind of magic system. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that.
Yeah,
I don't
I
think
think
it's
it's
a.
always, oh, go ahead, Thea.
No, Emily, go ahead.
Just speaking as somebody who has dabbled in chaos magic and who is coming at this from a Jewish perspective, I also think it's just an important thing to consider, like how much is sacrifice necessary and how much of this is actually a cultivation of one's own philosophy, the relationship with the divine, so on.
I'm coming at this from animism, and there is no sacrifice in animism, or at least not the brand that I know of. So for me, coming to all of these magic systems that are based on sacrifice, I mean, no, the stories themselves are not icky, but sometimes the sacrifice-based systems feel icky to me because, again, capitalism, like we mentioned earlier, and it reminds me too much of real life, which is already too full of transactions. So I don't think sacrifice in fiction as a system itself is immoral or a mistake. It's just a choice you make.
Also think it's how what your take is on it. I feel like when you're working with that kind of a story, it depends on if you are acknowledging that what the sacrifice is and how it affects everyone around the people sacrificing. I feel like there are ways that it can be a little off-putting, and there are ways that you can understand where the characters are coming from and why they're doing these things. But it really depends on as all things, I feel like in storytelling, it depends on the way the story is told and the respect and that is put into the narrative.
Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at, oh, please go ahead.
No, yeah, just to add on to those, I think, excellent points that I think often the things, if you are going to choose to do something that can have ethical consequences within a story, so things like using inborn magic, for example, can have ethical dimensions, or using sacrifice, sometimes if you're doing it in a way that is meant to explore certain aspects, so that I did write a book about a transactional imperialist European power system. And so that magic system sort of was a way to explore some of the consequences of that. So sometimes taking something that is icky is a way to explore icky things as well.
Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at building a magic system that's based on something not from our individual cultures, how are we going to reconcile creativity and appropriation? This is a question from Joanne in the chat. I will just briefly mention that in researching Western esotericism is how I ended up pranking myself into converting to Judaism. So it ended up being my culture after all. But do we have thoughts on this?
I feel like when you're writing, I feel like you shouldn't really, and this is coming from white me over here, very, very white me, should really, really be careful not to dig into other cultures and present it as something that you yourself have come up with. And also to be careful not to profit off of other people's culture. Understanding and researching, or even just absorbing various other cultures, sometimes you are going to pick up a few things that do feel like, oh, this is a cool idea I see as an underlying thing in many, many cultures, that I think, because I feel like there are a lot of similar lines that many cultures follow that show themselves in different mythology. And playing with that is an interesting thing. Playing with the specifics of another person's culture and mythology is crossing a line that you shouldn't cross. I feel like those are the stories of that culture to tell, and not your stories.
Okay.
Justine said it very well.
Thank you.
Yeah,
All right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right now, because I have to head off soon because I'm going to moderate a panel right after this one. And sorry, go ahead, Emily. I'm just going to tell everybody that I'm going to disappear soon.
Yeah, we are about to wrap up here. So thank you, everybody, for speaking with me and with everybody else today.
Thank you so much for having us. It was a great talk.
Yes, I'm glad that we got up to a lot of what we did. So.
Yes, absolutely. This is my book, The Embroidered Book, which is the one I've been talking about mostly today. Yes, it's so pretty. And I'll be in the Discord if anyone wants to chat.
So will I. You folks, I'm signing out. Yes, Beyond the Line of Trees.
Yes. You can also DM me on Discord. I'll probably get to it a little later because I do have that other panel. Yeah, I'm free for just asking to ping me and you can.
I'm Justine Manzano. I have The Skeleton Key is just coming out. It's part of the Keys and Guardians series. It's book 2. And I'll hang around the Discord and see you guys in there.
like I said, I'm Emily. I'm going to be hanging around the Discord. I have a novella with my wife called Uncommon Charm coming from Neon Hemlock next month. So peace out, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye, thank you.